Maybe you've purchased a gravel bike recently and it was set up one by, and after a couple weeks of riding, you've realized it's got limitations, right? It doesn't have the widest range of gears. It's kind of tough to get those low gears that you need for riding in the steeps or carrying a load without compromising your high gear. In this video, I'm going to show you guys how to set up two one-bys at the same time so you get the low and the high gears that you need. You're going to be able to apply these tips to bikes that don't look like they were meant to take a front derailleur, but we're going to do it, and it might make your local bike mechanic cry a little bit, but you'll have those sweet gears. When I got the Sklar, it didn't have any braze-ons to run a front derailleur, so I had to order one of these guys. Get in focus. You basically clamp this onto the seat tube and it gives you a place to put a front derailleur. Front derailleurs come in lots of flavors. Some of them have a built-in clamp like this one. Initially this seems like a good idea, but in my experience it makes more sense to get what's known as a braze-on derailleur because it gives you maximum adjustability. This is an example of a braze-on front derailleur. It doesn't have a clamp, but it bolts onto this piece, which I showed you earlier. With this piece, you can place it up and down on the seat tube, then bolt on your braze-on front derailleur, and again, you've got all this adjustability here in this slot. So that's how I mounted the front derailleur to the seat tube of the Sklar. I've done this with the Crest Bambora, and even my Tanglefoot hardtack, which is supposed to be one by only, I made it two by. We're going to work backwards from the derailleur to the shifter here. One more note, derailleurs have different cable pull. So some of them require the cable to be routed from the top, some from the bottom. This one from Microshift can be set up both top pull and bottom pull. I tend to get the ones that are bottom pull because they seem the most adaptable to most of the frames I've played around with. Okay, so we've got our front derailleur, we've got our cable attached to it. The cable is going to shoot down the seat tube and back up the down tube. But to negotiate the bend at the bottom bracket, you'll need some kind of cable stop. This is what I've used on multiple bikes. Again, these come in different clamp diameters. Just like the name suggests, it gives the cable housing a place to stop, so then you have exposed cable shooting up that you can clamp to the front derailleur. Our friends over at Camp and Go Slow also shared this interesting one from Problem Solvers. Instead of having a bolt-on stop, you can actually use a bottom bracket cable guide. What's cool about that one is that it has a cable stop, so you can run housing most of the way, and then it shoots the bare cable up to the front derailleur. The only downside I can think of that is that your bike needs some kind of hole so you can bolt it onto, and that might require having to pop off your cranks and the bottom bracket to bolt it into the frame. Unless the hole on your bike is threaded, I don't think this one is. I might have to run a nut. So we've got the front derailleur, we've got the cable, we've got the housing stop. How do we get it to the shifter, and which shifter should you use? Lots of frames these days affix the housing with zip ties or some quick release clips. If your frame is like that, you can just snip the zip ties, put the housing on the bike, and use the zip ties to hold it all together. The Sklar here was kind of a different and interesting challenge. On the Sklar, and I believe the Wild bikes do this as well, they use these bolt-on housing guides. I don't know if you can see it, but this only has slots for 2 bits of housing. In order to run the front derailleur on this bike, I needed one that could have 3 slots for housing. There's a couple different brands that sell things like this. I actually ordered the ones I'm using on the bike from Wild Bikes. I'll put the link below. I had to get 3 of them, replace these ones with those, and pretty much good to go at this point. Okay, so we figured out the housing problem, not the housing as in living situation problem, but the housing as in front derailleur housing problem. Let's be clear. In terms of which shifter you should use, I highly recommend just using a bar end friction shifter. These silver ones from Rivendell are probably my favorite. They've got that sweet ratcheting mechanism. And the reason is this: if you're shifting the front derailleur with a friction shifter, you have infinite trim. Most of the complaints that people have about the front derailleur can be solved by just running it friction shifting. Problem with running it index is that we expect 2 or 3 clicks to cover all the bases of where the front derailleur has to be in order to make it run quiet between the chain, the rear cassette, and the front chain rings. If you run it friction, look at this, you've got infinite trim. If it's rubbing, just move it. It stopped rubbing. That's it. Another thing that people don't talk about is that it's totally fine to have a friction front and an index rear. Think of it as like a shifting mullet. That way you can get the best of both worlds. Another big advantage is you can get more creative with your chainring combination. For example, on the Sklar, I'm running a 40-24, a much more compact and a much smaller chainring combination than most road cranksets. By running at friction, this allows me to use mountain bike derailleurs. This allows me to set up the front derailleur in, suboptimal conditions, but it still shifts great because friction. So yeah, I'm just gonna suggest you go friction shifting with the front. If you don't want to do bar ends, you can get a little bit weird and creative like I did with the hardtack. Actually, let me grab that bike. Here's the hardtack, non-drive side, so you can see where I put the shifter. I'm using this clamp thing, I'll put it up on the screen, which allows you to add down tube shifter bosses wherever on the bike. So here, just for fun, I put it up in suicide shifter configuration on the C-tube. There's actually historical precedence for doing it like this. I made a whole separate video about it, so check that out. But this is another option, completely viable, but not for everyone. I know what you're thinking. If this is meant to add down tube shifters, why not put it on the down tube? Well, smarty pants. On this bike, the Tanglefoot uses oversized tubing for the down tube. I forget what it is, but this particular clamp, isn't wide enough to work on a bike like this. Hence the C-tube shifter. But if this doesn't work for you, again, this has like the zip tie housing connection. You could just properly cable it to the shifter on the handlebar. I'm going to point out one other kind of quirky thing on the hardtack. The front derailleur I'm using is a top pull, but I'm running it in down pull configuration with the help of this pulley. Apparently this used to be a really popular thing with cross bikes or something. Where there's a will, there's a way. There's a whole host of quirky, interesting products that you can use to make your bike your own. Okay guys, to wrap it up, turning a 1x bike into a 2x bike shouldn't be that scary. There's definitely parts to make it happen. I feel like it's kind of a lost art these days, so that's why I wanted to make this video. This may not work on certain frames, especially if they have odd sized tubes or weird shapes or whatever. But for the most part, I found that most steel bikes can be modded into running 2x. So here's the thing. So SRAM comes out with the new mechanical Apex or whatever, can finally run a budget mullet setup, right? And it boasts 500-something% gear range, and that sounds super impressive until you realize that the old school 3xs would give you 620% range. This 2x here on the hardtack gives me 608% range. So that 500, 530, not very impressive whatsoever. I don't know why, but for whatever reason, the bike industry, at least for modern components, doesn't like low gearing, which doesn't make sense to me. I mean, back in the 60s and the 70s and the early mountain bikes, they ran triples, amazing range. We have lost all that gear range over the last couple of decades. We're slowly crawling it back with very expensive and very stupid solutions. But the front derailleur, as flawed as it is super versatile, really cheap when you compare it to something like the classified system or any hub gearing. You can get the range, you can keep those old parts and old bikes running, and you can make the bike your own. If you found this video helpful or entertaining, please consider supporting the channel by joining us on Patreon. It's how I'm able to make videos about, hacking front derailleurs in 2023. I'm not chilling the latest one by telling you that it's the most amazing thing, because it's actually not, in my opinion. It has its uses, probably mostly mountain biking, but for loaded touring, for road, 2x definitely still has a place. Front derailleur still has a place. It's not perfect, but the proposed solutions are just absurd. Buy some stickers, join us on Patreon, and as always, keep the supple side down.